Okay, so I'm sorry to have left you all alone with Kerry for a couple of weeks, but these things are unavoidable. And I hope you all enjoyed the Wasteland, or at least starting to enjoy the Wasteland. Um, but I recognise that it's a really difficult text, so I thought that what I would do to help you guys along was to actually start putting together some of these little tiny video lectures to help you understand the text, since you're going to have to do your in class on it in a couple of weeks, and I'm not going to be there to help you. So how I'm actually going to divide this up is I'm going to do little tiny lectures. First on this lecture on the social context of the Wasteland, how it actually comes about, where it fits within modernism, why it's an important text, who T.S. Eliot is, and how all of these things come together to create this great piece of art. And then there'll be a series of lectures on each of the five cantos out of the poem. And hopefully those, along with what you're doing with Kerry herself in class, will actually help you understand the text in a little bit more detail and a little bit better. So, where does the Wasteland come from? This is a really interesting question. It's a text that arrives in response, really, to World War One and the destruction and devastation that actually causes the world. But you have to understand what the world was like before the development of modernism. Why everything that happens is so difficult and so strange for European society after the devastation of World War One. Now, you have to recognise that the 100 years before World War One had actually been a pretty good 100 years. Um, Out of the destruction of and upheaval of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which had been a devastating um, event for Western Europe, millions of people had died, political upheaval, which had ended up with a world that made no more sense than the world that they actually did, where the revolutions that came out of the French Revolution actually created a worse outcome for people who had actually been hoping that revolution was going to create a better one, created after the Congress in Vienna in 1815 a sort of pan-European compact of political consensus, that the European war had been a disaster, that there needed to be some sort of mechanisms to allow for peaceful transformation and peaceful interaction between the great European powers. This is a political compact that had actually worked pretty well, apart from a few hiccups, the major one being the Crimean War and a couple of really minor spats like the 1816 Schleswig-Holstein War between Prussia and Denmark, and the Prussian-French War in 1870, which led to the siege of Paris. These had been fairly minor spats, and for the majority of people in Europe, um, these were little tiny foreign distant wars that didn't actually impact on their life in any real way, no more than the Afghanistan war affects most people who live in Australia. It's something you see in the headlines, it doesn't actually make any difference. So in the 19th century, you have this political consensus between the great powers. It actually leads to pretty much a century of peace, combined with a couple of really transformative social movements. You have enormous technological change, most of which is actually benefits people. I mean, this is not a completely smooth process, of course. It's not a process that is a hugely smooth transition with no losers for technological transformation. You never get that. But you have in the 19th century transformation from a mainly agrarian society into the industrialized world. And it's in the 19th, this is really an 18th century phenomenon, but in the 19th century you actually get the mediation of that transformation, so that it actually becomes a more evenly fruitful one. Now, this is not saying that the poor don't have particularly hard lives. It's just that during the 100 years between 1815 and 1914, what you get is a steady improvement in the lot of everybody. Standards of living increase, The technological changes actually allow for luxuries to come into the houses of the poor. Um, and this technological transformation of society is actually surprisingly accompanied by a really radical social transformation. And a radical social transformation actually benefits the vast majority of the population. And it's a really interesting social transformation because it's actually driven by a sort of alliance of religious, social, and political activism that transforms everything. And the 19th century is this huge period of social reform. It's the century that you have the abolition of slavery. It's the century that you have the development of constitutional government. It's the extension of the franchise. It's the extension of representative democracy, the development of social welfare programs, factory acts that protect workers for the first time, the development of trade unions, which actually give workers a voice and the poor a voice and rights that they haven't actually had before, the push for female suffrage, which is a long-running trend that doesn't actually come to fruition mostly until the early 20th century. But it's in the 19th century that people actually start talking about women actually having rights as real functioning human beings. You get protection of children. So children are now not, at the beginning of the 19th century, you could send children up chimneys when they're 3. We had lots of examples of children working in mines at the age of 4, opening trapdoors. You have huge numbers of children working in factories and mines because they're cheap labour. In a way that you still have some of this exploitation in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, people actually started saying that this is a really bad deal. This is a bad deal and we should actually do something about it. And within the Western European context, and that's something which Australia actually fits into, this is something that we actually did something about. We instituted legislation that said, no, we're actually not going to exploit children. That's certainly not really small children. And the age of which the exploitation of children and when children actually started to work really started to rise phenomenally. It's a century in where you start to actually get the development of universal educational policies. Now, this, of course, doesn't apply to everybody, and there are downsides to all sorts of reform movements. And I'm not saying that the 19th century is perfect in any way, because no century and no society is perfect. But if you look back at the century at the beginning, in June 1914, just before the First World War, and you look back at the century of development, what you get in Europe at this time is a world which is appreciably better for everybody. Even for the very poorest, life is better because of things like technological innovation that actually allows for sewerage, something that great cities like London didn't have in 1814, they had in 1914. Disease burdens were less, the development of hospitals, technology that actually improved people's lives, the whole idea of the poor having a holiday actually developed in the 19th century. So this has been a world where you have visible progress, and that creates a society which is incredibly optimistic. It's a society that sees the world as getting better, that sees the social contract as actually working, that has faith in the elite, which has generally, to its credit, during the 19th century, actually been willing to negotiate to give up some of its power to create a stable society. Now that comes out of the trauma of the French Revolution and the elites actually getting their heads chopped off. Something which is an object lesson for the elite, about the fact that sometimes maybe they need to share a bit of power. So you have this growing, flowing society, and it's incredibly optimistic. Technology has been transformative. Religion has been both a unifying and transformative force within society, and a society that has actually really and something that's actually really made a difference for that society. And there's this social contract where people know where they stand. It's not completely rigid. You have social mobility. Certainly the middle class is expanding exponentially over the 19th century. There is a development of the way for people to see out of poverty, but there's generally trust in institutions and the elite. And there's generally trust in the fact that the world is going to become a better place. There's trust in the fact that technology transforms people's lives for the better. And if you look at art from the 19th century, um, there's some of it is actually very socially activist. Things like Charles Dickens's work, which are all about transforming attitudes to the poor, actually creating social institutions that actually look at the lives of the poor. You have, but the art itself, if you look at visual art in particular, you see the optimism of the 19th century in all of the visual arts. It's beautiful, it's sentimental, it's romantic, it's light-filled. Even the Impressionists, which were radical in the 1870s, there's a Salon de Refusé. Oh, you can't bring that rubbish into here. It's just not perfect and it's not realistic enough. But it is still light, beautiful, colourful. You have Manet's beautiful bar girls standing at the bar offering you drinks as representatives of the working class. You have Renoir's pictures of pretty ladies picnicking on the sides of the banks. Even in the streams of art that are not romantic, you have this image of beauty and colour and optimism. Now, I can't work out how to actually show you these pictures and put these things all together. So you can look up Impressionist art. You can have a look at the art from the Art Nouveau, the Pre-Raphaelites, and you have a look at how beautiful and how romantic and how sentimental and how fundamentally optimistic it is about human nature and human society. And then you get World War One, and World War One breaks the world. We still live with the consequences of the way that that cultural hegemony, that sense of understanding, that sense of optimism is broken during World War One. And it was so sudden, so unexpected, and sadly, so really unnecessary. If you ask historians what causes World War One, if you ask historians what causes World War Two, it's easy. Hitler. He invaded Poland. He was a really bad man. Fascism is something that we needed to fight against. There's a cause. There's a start. There is a fundamental moral imperative that makes World War II make much more sense than World War I. But if you ask historians about World War I, what causes World War I, they give you a list of things: armaments, alliances, militarism, imperialism, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. None of these things in and of themselves actually caused the war. It's a lack of imagination and leadership on the part of some rulers. It's events that get out of control. It's public pressure. It's the public's lack of understanding of the real consequences of war. Remember, there's not been 100 years since there's been a major European conflict that involves vast majority of the population. That's generations. People have forgotten what war on a really large scale actually means. And it's a society that is so fundamentally innocent in a way that we're not innocent. We can never be innocent in the way that they were in that pre-war period, because we live in a world that has been transformed by what happened during World War I. It is the critical moment in Western European history. Everything that's happened in the 20th century falls out from the destruction of that. And there's this terribly poignant photograph taken at Sandringham about a year, a little bit more, 15 months, about a year before the war starts, where there's Edward VII of England, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, all together picnicking at Sandringham, because they're first cousins. They're family. It makes the whole thing more and more ridiculous. But people get caught up in this whole notion of nationalism. They get caught up in the whole idea that war is controllable. You have a situation where people actually live in a world where they think that war is a big adventure and it's all going to be over for Christmas, before Christmas. This innocence, this belief in the world's ability to control events, the belief in that elites will actually come to a conclusion and that things are actually in people's control, is shattered by World War I. And I think the best example of the way that this innocence is shattered is the Kinder Battalion that marches into France at the end of 1914. Now, this is 5,000 schoolboys, 15 and 16-year-olds who have run away to join the army because they want to be involved in the big adventure that is World War One. And the German army is so convinced that France is just going to roll up like it did in 1870, and that they don't want these boys to miss out. They want them to be able to go home and boast about their role that they played in this great war against the French. And everything is going to be wonderful. And it's all going to be over by Christmas, and everybody's going to be happy, and the boys are going to go home, and they're going to have big stories of comradeship, and it's going to be fantastic. Until they march into Belgium and march into the machine guns, and the 5,000 schoolboys are mown down in bloody puddles on the Belgian, the fields of Flanders. They're amongst the first mass casualties of the war, and it's a poignant and terrifying symbol of the loss of innocence that this war is about to cause, and the way that it is actually about to destroy this sense of European consensus. And the world breaks. And it breaks big time. And everything that has seemed to be sensible, everything that we've understood about how the world works, faith in elites, faith in God, faith in technology, all of that is destroyed. We literally tear the world to pieces. You see nothing more symbolic about the way the world is torn and the way that people understand the world being torn to pieces than in the actual physical state of the Western Front. Human endeavour, which has been generally towards progress, smashes 1,000 years of culture and tears even the living ground itself. It poisons the very earth. It's years in some of the spaces on the battlefield before anything will grow again. We literally poison the earth with chemical warfare, with the cordite, knocking down what is European culture. And it's impossible to overestimate the existential shock that World War I actually caused to society. People just don't know where they stand anymore. And that sense of optimism, that sense of hope in the future, that sense of consensus, cultural consensus, faith in the future, optimism about progress, all of that is blown out of the water. And it's in this context that you get The Wasteland. You can't read The Wasteland outside of that context. There are other things that are in play here. It's not the only thing. But The Wasteland is a reflection of a society in real trauma. It's hugely traumatic. Nobody is untouched by what happens in World War One. Apart from the millions of dead, you have tens of millions who are maimed, families that are torn to pieces. You see the disabled walking on the streets. In the Australian context, for example, you lose 60,000 men in World War I out of the 360,000 who served, which is a pretty significant percentage of the population because Australia's population in 1914 is actually quite small. So you lose 60,000 men in the 4 years of the war. But in the 10 years after the war, 10,000 veterans die every year. And it's another 100,000. And those are names that are not on the War Memorial, but those are all victims of the war themselves. And that's a situation which is pretty analogous to what goes on with the rest of the world. It also breaks the economies. In England, immediately after the war, in the 2 years after the war, there are 2 million unemployed. 2 million. Just think about that. Imagine if there were 2 million unemployed in Australia today. And this is a society that doesn't have social welfare networks that have developed in the 20th century to deal with this. In Germany, you've got hyperinflation, your agricultural depression that really doesn't shift until after World War II. It's a society in trauma in all sorts of ways. Faith in everything that you've believed in is gone, done and dusted. And how does Eliot fit into this? Well, Eliot doesn't serve in the war. Eliot's a funny sort of fellow. He's American. He's a genius. He's an academic prodigy, scholar, amazing English scholar. He's a big mama's boy, though. coddled from childhood. He doesn't have to serve. He's probably not physically well enough to serve. But he goes from coddled mama's boy to a very unhappy marriage, which some scholars actually see The Wasteland as a reflection, as a poem about bad marriage. And there's a fairly strong tradition in Western Europe leading all the way back to Chaucer, which actually talks about bad marriages and the symbolic of that. And certainly those sort of things exist. But Eliot has moved from America, where he's born, at quite a young age, in his very early 20s, by the time he's 21, he moves from America to England, and he becomes ensconced in this European culture which he sees as the fountainhead of all scholarship, of all knowledge. And he comes into this world where you've got this vast knowledge of European culture and scholarship and tradition that's broken. And this is where modernism actually comes into it. Modernism is a really very interesting, set of responses. Now, the cultural hegemony that you have in the 19th century, there is some push against that. Scholars of modernism actually push modernism, the development of modernism, back just before the First World War. They see its trends developing as a response to the cultural weight of the 19th century, in that sense of cultural optimism and cultural hegemony. Now, that is true. Certainly you could see that. And it's not a surprise that there are people pushing back against the dominant culture. That's what people do. That's how ideas develop and change. You have a consensus and then people react to that consensus. Modernism is a different, where it gets its real kick in the pants though is in the post-war period, because you have this destruction of that hegemony, you have this destruction of these ideas, and so you get modernism developing. Modernism is a new way to deal with a fragmented world. It's a rejection of this whole idea that there are cultural norms that everybody should subscribe to, that there is one answer, that there is one way, that progress is linear. And so you get what really typifies modernism, I think. The most common thread is its fragmentation. That there is no, and its rejection, the ultimate rejection of the whole idea that beauty necessarily is the answer. And modernists make us work for a living. Modernists don't want to provide us with all the answers. Maybe I think because the answers that people have been given in the period just before the war had actually led to something incredibly destructive. That the assumption that there was one way to do things led the whole world into destruction, because that is what it felt like for people. It felt like the world and everything that they understood had been destroyed. And it's in this context that T.S. Eliot writes The Wasteland. Now, it's not published until October 1922, but T.S. Eliot actually starts writing The Wasteland in 1919, directly after the war. He's starting The Wasteland at about the same time that the Treaty of Versailles is being written. You cannot separate this piece of work from that cultural transition. You can't separate modernism from the rejection of the cultural hegemony of the 19th century, the rejection of the whole idea of linear progress, and the fact that there are answers, the social control, that the world is actually becoming a better place. Because in 1919, the world didn't feel like it was a better place. The world felt like it was far worse than it had been in the year 1914. And on any objective measure, that's actually true. Nothing good comes out of World War I, except perhaps the art that responds to it. And T.S. Eliot, well, it's not my favourite poem, because you all know that my favourite poem is Ulysses. And I love Ulysses. You know how much I love Ulysses. But as much as that's my favourite, as much as that is a work of pure, utter joy and beauty, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is actually much more important. And it's much more important because it is something new. It is a radical rejection of the 19th century's understanding of the world working in a particular way, and the triumph of humanity over chaos. And it is beautiful. It's difficult. T.S. Eliot does not take his audience lightly. He expects you to work for your living when you're reading this. I hope your brains aren't going to dribble out your ears too much, but he expects great things of you. He expects us to work at understanding it, because it is through working at understanding the text that we actually find a transition from chaos into something new, into a new understanding about the world. And that is why it's significant, because this is T.S. Eliot, who's going through chaos in his personal life, who lives in a world that is chaotic and doesn't understand its position or place anymore. And this is his attempt to pull that together into some sense of meaning, to take the fragments of the past and to build into something. The Wasteland, despite its title and despite the fact that a lot of it is really bleak, ultimately is a poem about transition. It is the fact that you can transition, that disaster does not need to overwhelm us. It's a poem that provides us with some sense of hope about the future. No certainty, no promises that life is going to be easy, no clear path to a better world, but the fact that out of chaos can come something new. And it is full of the most beautiful imagery and words and pictures, and it has really important things to say. So even though you're all going to cry for the next couple of weeks, hopefully by the time you get to the end of this study of the Wasteland, you're really going to appreciate how profoundly important it is, how beautiful it is, and how wondrous the insights into the way the human mind and psyche actually work actually are. So I'll finish this one up now, and I'll pause. Hopefully that this will all work, and I can pop it up on the classroom, and you'll be able to see me rattle about social context and T.S. Eliot. And then we'll come and I'll post a series of short ones on each of the cantos that you'll be able to work through. And the good thing about them being on video is that at least you'll be able to go back to them and have another look if you really need to think about the way that the poem goes. But remember, T.S. Eliot expects you to work for your living. You're going to earn what you get out of this poem. And you are all hopefully going to get something great and fabulous out of it. Okay, that's video number 1.